May 3rd, 1945. The monsoon rains had not yet arrived in central Burma, and the air hung thick with dust and the smell of burning bamboo. In a clearing beside the Irrawaddy River, 23 women sat in silence beneath a canvas tarp stretched between acacia trees. Their faces were gaunt, their clothing reduced to tattered remnants of what had once been nurse uniforms, administrative attire, and civilian dress. Some stared at the muddy ground. Others watched the tree line with hollow eyes that had long since stopped hoping for rescue. They had been prisoners for 3 years, moved from camp to camp as the Japanese Imperial Army retreated deeper into Burma, always one step ahead of the British advance. They were Japanese nationals, most of them civilians, who had been working in Rangoon when the war erupted across the Pacific. A few military nurses captured during the chaotic fall of Singapore. Now, they were something else entirely, forgotten women in a forgotten corner of a dying empire. The youngest among them was 21, the oldest was 54. They had watched malaria claim 6 of their number. They had buried 2 more who simply stopped eating, their spirits broken by the endless march through jungle and the casual cruelty of guards who saw them as burdens rather than citizens of the empire they served. The women had learned to make themselves invisible, to speak only when spoken to accept their rations of wormy rice and brackish water without complaint. They had learned that survival meant submission, that every day alive was a day stolen from the jungle's appetite for the weak. Their guards were 7 soldiers, remnants of a shattered regiment that had lost contact with command weeks earlier. These men were young, most barely out of their teens, but the war had aged them into something harder than their years suggested. They carried rifles with bayonets fixed, though ammunition had grown scarce. They wore uniforms that hung loose on frames depleted by hunger and dysentery. Their eyes darted constantly toward the forest, listening for the rumble of British tanks or the crack of rifle fire that would signal the enemy's approach. The women understood that these guards were as trapped as they were, caught between the advancing British forces and a homeland that seemed impossibly distant across the ocean. But understanding did not breed sympathy. The guards had made it clear that if capture seemed imminent, the women would not be allowed to fall into enemy hands alive. It was a matter of honor, they said, a matter of preventing shame to the empire. On that morning in May, one of the guards, a corporal named Tanaka, had struck a woman for speaking without permission. She had asked only for water, her voice barely a whisper, but exhaustion and fear had frayed the corporal's nerves to breaking. The blow sent her sprawling into the mud, blood trickling from her split lip. The other women did not move. They had learned this lesson too. Any protest would bring more violence. Any show of solidarity would be punished collectively. So they sat in silence, while the woman pulled herself upright, mud caking one side of her face, and returned to her place beneath the tarp without a sound. The war in Burma had become a war of ghosts. The Japanese forces that had stormed through Southeast Asia with such confidence in early 1942 were now scattered fragments, cut off from supply lines, abandoned by a high command that had turned its attention to defending the home islands from American bombers. The British 14th Army, under General William Slim, had pushed south through the mountains and jungles, reclaiming territory mile by bloody mile. The monsoons of 1944 had turned the campaign into a nightmare of mud and disease, but by the spring of 1945, the Japanese position had become untenable. Rangoon would fall within days. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were retreating east toward Thailand or trying to reach the coast for evacuation that would never come. Most would die in the jungle, victims of starvation, disease, or ambush by British and Indian patrols. The women prisoners existed in a liminal space, neither soldiers nor civilians in any meaningful sense. International conventions that might have protected them held no weight in the chaos of a collapsing front. The Japanese military's treatment of its own female nationals varied wildly depending on circumstance and the temperament of individual commanders. Some units had evacuated their civilians early in the campaign. Others, overwhelmed by the speed of the retreat, had simply left women to fend for themselves, or incorporated them into the baggage train of refugees and wounded that slowed every column to a crawl. This particular group had been unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when a field hospital was overrun. They had been marching ever since, moved from camp to camp by guards who seemed to have no orders beyond keeping them away from the British. In the culture these women had been raised in, duty to the nation transcended personal safety. They had been taught that the greatest honour was to serve the empire, even unto death. Many believed this deeply, had internalized it until it became indistinguishable from their own thoughts. But 3 years of captivity had introduced doubt into that certainty. Doubt crept in during the long nights when fever dreams made the line between waking and sleeping blur into hallucination. Doubt whispered when another woman died and was buried in an unmarked grave far from home. Doubt asked uncomfortable questions about what duty meant when the empire that demanded it had seemingly forgotten they existed. The afternoon brought the sound of engines, distant at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable rumble of heavy vehicles moving along the rough track that passed for a road 2 kilometers to the west. The guards scrambled to attention, barking orders at the women to gather their belongings, though the women possessed almost nothing beyond the clothes they wore. Within minutes, the camp was struck, the tarp folded, all evidence of their presence erased, except for the trampled earth and the smell of their latrine trench. The guards formed the women into a column, rifles pointed not outward toward potential threats, but inward toward the prisoners themselves. They moved east, away from the sound of engines, deeper into the secondary growth forest where the trees grew dense and the undergrowth clutched at their legs. The pace was brutal. 2 women collapsed within the first hour. The guards dragged them upright and pushed them forward with rifle butts. There would be no rest. There would be no mercy. Behind them, the sound of engines grew closer, and with it came new sounds. The crack of small arms fire, the thump of mortars, the sharp British voices shouting orders in English that none of the guards understood. The engagement was brief, lasting perhaps 20 minutes, and then silence returned to the forest, broken only by the laboured breathing of exhausted women and frightened young men pretending to be soldiers. At dusk, they stopped in a bamboo thicket beside a stream. The water was brown with silt, but it was water, and the women drank deeply, despite knowing it would likely bring dysentery. The guards established a perimeter, posting 2 men on watch while the others collapsed in exhaustion. No fire was lit, no food was distributed because none remained. They would sleep hungry and wake to another day of running from an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. One of the women, a former schoolteacher named Kimiko, sat apart from the others. She was 42 years old and had been working as a translator in Rangoon when the war caught her. 3 years of captivity had taken 30 pounds from her frame and most of her hair, which had fallen out in clumps during a bout of typhus the previous winter. She had survived by becoming useful, by speaking English well enough to occasionally translate when the guards captured Allied propaganda leaflets or prisoners. This had earned her certain small privileges, an extra cup of rice, a blanket when others had none, the guards' grudging respect. But it had also isolated her from the other women, who whispered that she had become too friendly with their captors. Kimiko understood their suspicion. She understood that survival often required compromises that looked like collaboration from the outside. What they did not know, what she had told no one, was that she had been listening carefully to everything the guards said when they thought she was not paying attention. She knew that Corporal Tanaka had received no orders in 6 weeks. She knew that their unit had been declared lost, presumed dead or captured, by whatever remained of their command structure. She knew that the guards were terrified, that they spoke late at night about surrendering to the British, though such talk was dangerous even among themselves. She knew that they had discussed, more than once, what they would do with the women if capture became inevitable. The answer was always the same. They would not allow the women to fall into enemy hands alive. It would be done quickly, they said. It would be merciful compared to what the British would do. They spoke of atrocity propaganda, of stories they had been told about Allied soldiers raping and murdering Japanese women, about torture and degradation that would make death preferable. Whether they believed these stories or simply needed to believe them to justify what they were planning, Kimiko could not say. But she knew with certainty that if British troops appeared, the guards would turn their rifles on the women before turning them on themselves or attempting to flee. She had considered telling the others, but had decided against it. What purpose would it serve except to spread panic? The women were powerless to prevent their fate. They had no weapons, no strength left for resistance, nowhere to run, even if they could escape. Knowing the sword was falling would not stop its descent. So Kimiko kept the knowledge locked inside herself, a lead weight that grew heavier each day, and waited for whatever end was coming. May 4th, 1945. Dawn came grey and overcast, the sky a ceiling of clouds that promised rain but delivered only humid stillness. The guards roused the women before first light and forced them into column. They would move north now, paralleling the river, staying beneath the canopy where British spotter planes could not see them from above. The pace was slower than the previous day, not by choice, but by necessity. 3 more women could barely walk. Their legs swollen with edema, their minds fogged by malnutrition. The guards prodded them forward with increasingly vicious efficiency until one woman, a nurse who had once worked in a Tokyo hospital, simply sat down in the trail and refused to rise. The corporal struck her across the face with the back of his hand. She did not react. He struck her again, harder, and still she remained seated, her eyes fixed on something far away that only she could see. The other guards gathered around, uncertain. They argued in low voices while the column stood motionless, the women watching with expressions that registered nothing. Finally, one of the guards raised his rifle. The crack of the shot echoed through the forest, sending birds screaming into the sky. The woman slumped sideways into the ferns. The guards ordered the column forward, stepping over the body without ceremony. Behind them, blood spread in a slow pool, darkening the earth. The women walked in silence, but something had changed. The execution had crossed a threshold, made explicit what had always been implicit. They were not prisoners to be protected, but liabilities to be disposed of when convenient. The pretense of duty, of honour, of serving the empire by safeguarding its citizens had been stripped away by a single gunshot. What remained was raw survival instinct colliding with rigid ideology, and the women were caught between those forces like grass between millstones. By midday, they had covered perhaps 5 kilometres. The forest had grown quieter, the usual sounds of insects and birds muted, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound of movement through the underbrush, heavy footfalls that did not belong to wildlife. The guards froze, weapons raised, and for a long moment the world contracted to nothing but the hammering of hearts and the rustle of something large moving through the vegetation ahead. British soldiers emerged from the tree line, 12 men in mud-caked uniforms carrying Lee Enfield rifles and Sten guns. They moved with the casual confidence of troops who had fought through 3 years of jungle warfare and no longer feared what the forest might contain. Their faces were weathered, their eyes alert but not cruel. When they saw the Japanese guards and the column of women, they stopped and raised their weapons in a practiced motion that suggested this was not the first time they had encountered such a scene. The Japanese guards panicked. 2 tried to run. 1 raised his rifle toward the women. The British reaction was immediate and professional. A burst of automatic fire cut down the guard who aimed at the prisoners. The others dropped their weapons and raised their hands, though one continued to shout orders at the women in Japanese, his voice shrill with fear and rage. A British sergeant, a thick-built man with a Lancashire accent, stepped forward and barked a command in English. When the shouting guard did not stop, the sergeant struck him across the jaw with the butt of his rifle, and the man collapsed into silence. The women stood frozen, uncertain whether they had been saved or simply transferred from one captor to another. Everything they had been told about the British suggested they should expect violence, humiliation, death. Instead, the soldiers secured the Japanese guards with practiced efficiency, binding their hands and setting them under watch. Then the sergeant turned his attention to the women, and what happened next would remain burned in their memory for the remainder of their lives. He lowered his rifle. He removed his helmet. He looked at them not with hatred or lust or contempt, but with something closer to pity mixed with professional concern. He spoke in English, his voice even and calm, and though most of the women did not understand the words, they understood the tone. He was telling them they were safe. He was telling them the war was over for them. He was telling them they would be cared for. One of the women, the youngest at 21, began to weep, then another. Within moments, the entire column was shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than tears, from a place where 3 years of terror and degradation and enforced silence had been stored because there had been no safe place to release it. They wept for the friends they had buried. They wept for the woman shot that morning. They wept for themselves, for the girls they had been before the war, for the futures that had been stolen and could never be recovered. They wept because for the first time in longer than they could remember, someone with power over them had chosen mercy instead of cruelty. The British soldiers stood uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond to this flood of emotion. They were fighting men, trained for violence, not for this. But they did not leave. They did not turn away in embarrassment or disgust. They waited while the women cried themselves out, and then, with awkward gentleness, they began to distribute their own rations. Tins of bully beef, hardtack biscuits, canteens of clean water. One soldier, barely older than the youngest prisoner, offered his jacket to a woman whose clothing had disintegrated to the point of indecency. She accepted it with shaking hands and clutched it to her chest, as if it were treasure. Kimiko, the translator, stepped forward. She spoke in careful English, her voice rough from disuse, and explained who the women were, where they had come from, what they had endured. The sergeant listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in English, that Kimiko translated for the others, that they would be taken to a field hospital 10 kilometers to the west. They would be given food and medical care. They would not be harmed. They were under British protection now, and any man who violated that protection would answer to him personally. The women did not entirely believe him. How could they? Trust had been beaten out of them by years of betrayal and violence. But they had no choice except to follow where the soldiers led. So they formed into column again, this time with British troops flanking them protectively rather than Japanese guards herding them at gunpoint. The difference was subtle, but profound. They were no longer prisoners being driven toward an uncertain fate. They were refugees being escorted towards safety. The march to the field hospital took 4 hours, moving slowly to accommodate the weakest among the women. The British soldiers showed patience that astonished their charges. When one woman collapsed from exhaustion, 2 soldiers fashioned a stretcher from bamboo and canvas and carried her. When another fell behind, struggling with legs too swollen to keep pace, a corporal simply picked her up and carried her on his back as if she weighed nothing. These were small acts, unremarkable in themselves, but to women who had been treated as disposable burdens for 3 years, they felt like miracles. The field hospital was a collection of tents in a cleared area beside a dirt road. Medical personnel, both British and Indian, moved among rows of wounded soldiers and liberated prisoners of various nationalities. The doctors took one look at the women and immediately began triage, identifying the most critical cases for immediate treatment. The women were given real food for the first time in months, not just rice, but vegetables and fruit and meat. They were given clean water in unlimited quantities. They were given soap and towels, and the opportunity to wash away 3 years of accumulated filth and degradation. That night, sleeping on cots with clean blankets, surrounded by people who had no reason to show them kindness, and yet did anyway, several of the women experienced something close to cognitive dissonance. The world they had been taught to understand, the clear divisions between allies and enemies, the certainty that surrender meant dishonor and capture meant torture, all of it collapsed under the weight of simple human decency. The British were supposed to be monsters. The British were supposed to be devils who would violate and murder them. Instead, the British had saved their lives and asked for nothing in return except the satisfaction of having done the right thing. Over the following days, as the women regained some measure of strength, they began to talk among themselves about what had happened. Some struggled to reconcile their rescue with everything they had believed about the war and their place in it. They had been taught that death was preferable to capture, that the Empire's honour required absolute sacrifice, that their duty was to die rather than submit to enemy hands. But they had not died. They had been captured, and instead of the promised horrors, they had found mercy. What did that mean about everything else they had been told? What did that mean about the Empire they had served without question? Others resisted these questions. To examine the ideology too closely was to risk discovering that their suffering had been based on lies, that the sacrifices demanded of them had served no higher purpose, that they had endured hell for nothing more than the vanity of men who commanded from safe positions far behind the lines. It was easier to maintain the framework they had always known, to tell themselves that the British who had saved them were exceptions, that the enemy was still the enemy, even if these particular representatives had behaved with unexpected humanity. Kimiko, the translator, found herself in a unique position. She spent her days helping the British doctors communicate with the Japanese women, translating symptoms and treatment plans, facilitating the slow process of rehabilitation. She also translated for interrogators who wanted to know about Japanese positions and troop movements, though the women knew little of strategic value. During these sessions, she observed the British soldiers closely, looking for signs of the cruelty and barbarism she had been warned about. She found instead men who were tired and homesick, who spoke of wives and children waiting in England, who seemed more interested in finishing the war and going home than in punishing their former enemies. One evening, the sergeant who had led the patrol that rescued them sat with Kimiko outside the hospital tent, sharing a cigarette in the humid twilight. He asked her what she thought of England, whether she had ever visited before the war. She told him she had studied English literature at university, that she had dreamed once of seeing London, of visiting the places she had read about in Dickens and Austen. The sergeant smiled and said perhaps she would get that chance now, once all the madness was over. They talked for an hour about books and plays and the small, ordinary things that make life worth living, and it occurred to Kimiko that she had never had a conversation like this with one of her own guards. The Japanese soldiers had seen her as a responsibility, a burden, a problem to be managed. This British sergeant saw her as a person. The war in Burma ended officially on May 17, 1945, when British forces recaptured Rangoon and the remnants of the Japanese army either surrendered or fled into the mountains where most would perish before reaching friendly territory. For the women at the field hospital, this news arrived as a distant abstraction. The war had already ended for them 2 weeks earlier, in that moment when British soldiers chose protection over vengeance, mercy over cruelty, humanity over ideology. They remained at the hospital for another month, while arrangements were made for their repatriation. Some would return to Japan, to cities that had been firebombed into rubble, to families that might or might not have survived. Others, having no family left to return to, would scatter across Southeast Asia or eventually make their way to the United States or Australia as refugees. All of them would carry the memory of that morning in the forest, of the moment when the world they thought they understood revealed itself to be far more complex and far less certain than they had been taught. The liberation of these women was not strategic. It served no military purpose. It earned no medals or commendations for the soldiers involved. It was simply a decision made by ordinary men to do the decent thing because the alternative was unconscionable. In the vast catalogue of the Second World War's atrocities and horrors, in the accounting of millions dead and civilizations shattered, this small mercy barely registers. But for 22 women who had been marched toward death and found life instead, it was everything. Years later, when historians would chronicle the Burma campaign, they would speak of great battles and strategic turning points, of Kohima and Imphal, of the reconquest of Rangoon, and the collapse of Japanese resistance. They would not speak of this encounter in the forest, of this moment when ideology met humanity and humanity proved stronger. The women themselves, scattered to different corners of the world, would rarely speak of it either. The experience was too raw, too personal, too tangled with questions about duty and honor and the lies they had believed. But in quiet moments, in the private spaces of memory where truth lives unfiltered by shame or propaganda, they would return to that clearing beside the stream, to the sight of British soldiers lowering their weapons and offering food and water, to the profound shock of discovering that the enemy could choose kindness, that mercy was possible even in war, that the human capacity for decency could survive the machinery of ideology that sought to crush it. The lesson they learned was simple and terrible and beautiful, that everything they had been taught about honor and duty and sacrifice had been complicated by the discovery that the people they were told to fear had shown them more compassion than their own commanders, that nationalism and patriotism and all the grand abstractions that justify war become hollow when confronted with the concrete reality of suffering and the choice to alleviate it or inflict more. They learned that freedom is not an ideology or a political system, but a moment, repeated across time, when someone with power chooses to use it for protection rather than domination. They learned that abundance is not measured in rice or territory, but in the sudden appearance of basic human kindness when all expectation of it has been extinguished. They learned that the greatest betrayal is not defeat in war, but the realization that those who claim to act in your name were willing to kill you to preserve their conception of honor. The war ended, as all wars do, but the questions it raised persisted. In the decades that followed, as the women built new lives from the ruins of the old, they would occasionally encounter their countrymen who had never left Japan, who had never experienced the war beyond propaganda broadcasts and rationing. These people would speak confidently about duty and sacrifice, about the righteousness of the cause, about how Japan had fought honorably even in defeat. The women would listen in silence, knowing they could never explain what they had learned in that forest. That the only people who could understand were others who had stood at the edge of death and been pulled back by the unexpected mercy of strangers. In the end, what they carried forward was not bitterness or gratitude or political conviction, but rather a bone-deep understanding that the world is both crueler and kinder than any ideology admits, that the line between humanity and inhumanity runs through every heart, and that the only truth worth preserving is that in any situation, no matter how dark, there exists the possibility of choosing mercy over cruelty, protection over violence, life over death. The British soldiers who saved them had made that choice without hesitation, without calculation, because some instinct deeper than training or propaganda had told them it was right. That choice had reverberated through 22 lives, transforming not just their immediate circumstances, but their understanding of what humans are capable of when freed from the machinery of war. The monsoon rains came late that year, arriving in June with the violence of water long denied. They washed away the blood-soaked earth where battles had been fought, filled the bomb craters with clean water, turned the dust of the dry season into the mud of renewal. The forest reclaimed the temporary roads and forgotten campsites, growing over the scars of war with patient indifference. In time, the physical traces of that encounter would disappear entirely, absorbed back into the jungle that had witnessed it all and would outlast every participant by centuries. But the memory persisted, passed down through families, recorded in private journals, preserved in the silences that fell when certain topics were raised. It persisted because it represented something essential about the human experience, something that transcends politics and nationalism and all the grand abstractions that philosophers and politicians invoke to justify their actions. It represented the simple, irreducible fact that when faced with the choice between cruelty and kindness, between domination and protection, between ideology and humanity, some people will always choose the better path, And in doing so, they redeem not just themselves, but the entire species. The women who were saved that day in the Burmese forest would carry this knowledge forward into the strange peace that followed history's most devastating war. They would watch their former enemies become allies, watch their own country transform from empire to democracy, watch the certainties of their youth dissolve into the ambiguities of a world that refused simple categories. Through it all, they would remember the moment when mercy came from strangers, when the people they had been taught to hate had shown them more humanity than their own commanders, when the war revealed itself to be not a contest between good and evil, but a tragedy in which ordinary people on all sides were caught in machinery beyond their control or comprehension. That memory would remain with them until the end, a small light against the darkness, a reminder that even in the worst of times, even when every system and institution seems designed to crush the human spirit, there exists the possibility of choice, the capacity for mercy, the stubborn persistence of human decency that no amount of propaganda or cruelty can entirely extinguish. It was a truth worth preserving, worth passing on, worth remembering long after the last veteran had died and the war had become nothing but history. Because in that truth lies the only real hope humanity has, that we are capable, always, of being better than we are, of choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, of seeing the humanity in others even when everything tells us to see only enemies. That choice, made again and again across generations, is what separates civilization from barbarism, hope from despair, life from death. It is the only thing in the end that matters.